like we are live and we can talk to each other, and some of us can actually even see each other. But a great big, very big hello to you good colleagues in vector control, and welcome to our APMEN TechTalk webinar on, this time around, repellent applications for reduced outdoor malaria. Our periodic get-togethers. This is a fun event. We all learn together, we share, and we learn from the respective experts in their fields. A wonderful event that I hope you will enjoy as much as we do. So many thanks to all of you for taking time to listen in and hopefully ask questions. Make use of the opportunity to learn. You may be interested to know that as of a few minutes ago, 354 people have registered to attend, and they represent 54 different countries from across the globe. Now, it's 354 people that registered, but typically only about half that number actually attend because they're distracted or they're just not able to participate for some reason or other. But that's okay. Half 354 is still a good number. I have the great pleasure to share again that APMEN recently announced the new chairs of the 3 APMEN working groups. And for our vector control working group, our chairperson for the next 2 years will be Dr. Rose Nani Mudin. And we honestly could not have asked for a better person to take on the task of leading and guiding our vector control working group. Dr. Rose is currently Deputy Director for Communicable Diseases in the Ministry of Health in Malaysia, and she brings with her decades of experience in the control of vector-borne diseases. So I'm going to ask Dr. Rose just to introduce herself and to say a few words of welcome, and then we move on to the talks after that. So over to you, Dr. Rose.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Leo, for your kind introductions. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all our distinguished audience, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to the APMEN Technical Talks. I hope you will enjoy these talks. I would like to sincerely thank APMEN and APALMA Committee for giving me the opportunity to lead the APMEN Vector Control Working Group. It is an honor to me to be the chairman for this great working group, and I realized the important responsibility of this group to the member countries, especially Asia Pacific Community of Vector Control Practitioners, including private sectors and non-governmental organizations, and towards achieving our goals to eliminate human malaria by 2030. APMEN Vector Control Working Group is here to serve you and to support, to facilitate you in your effort to eliminate malaria. I believe expertise from this group will be able to give technical advices and guidance on how to perform the malaria prevention and control activity effectively and efficiently in your countries. We welcome any questions from you, and do not hesitate to contact us. You can email it to me or to Leo, to Dr. Leo, and we will welcome any suggestions or any innovations that you want to propose to us. I would like to thank APMEN and APALMA again for organizing this excellent webinar, and have a fruitful webinar to all our audience. Thank you very much.
So, Dr. Rose, thank you sincerely for those very warm words of welcome and introduction. And please know that we genuinely appreciate you making yourself available as chair for the APMEN VCWG to provide support to our 21 APMEN member states towards reaching malaria elimination. Let me also use this opportunity to thank Dr. Ponsi Hein and Dr. Tinshaw Thu for their very efficient activities, quietly working away in the background to make sure that the webinar takes place smoothly, no glitches, everything on track. So thank you, Porn and Tin, and welcome also to Wulan, who's going to help with the webinars going forward. So I need to spend a few seconds on how this webinar will unfold, and I promise you I'll try and be brief. We will have 5 short PowerPoint presentations back to back, most of them only 5 to 8 minutes in length, so it's not too strenuous. This will be followed by a question and answer session. Everyone will be muted and video off, except for our panelists. But our audience members can submit written questions during the presentations. Use the question box at the bottom. But I want to ask you this, please precede your question with the name of the panel member you would like to respond to your question. So if you have a particular person in mind when you're framing your question, please put at the beginning of your question, Dr. Marta or Dr. Peter or whatever, and then put your question. Then that person, we know who you'd prefer to have the question being responded to. After the Q&A session, there's a very short poll, which is intended just to assess your opinion of the webinar. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on the APMEN and the ORIN websites in a few days' time. Details of those 2 sites will be available on your screens at some point or other. The 2 websites where probably in about 48 hours time, but certainly by 72 hours after the webinar, the recorded webinar will be available. If you have friends you want to invite to listen to the webinar. So let's get to the presentations. Dr. Porn, would you mind placing our esteemed speakers, or they're already on screen? I need to mention that unfortunately, Dr. Ian Mendenhall is not able to join us because of a foot injury that his daughter incurred a day or so ago. And unfortunately, he has to deal with that injury as a priority, but he has taken the trouble to prepare a recorded presentation, which is very generous of him to find time to do so. So his recorded presentation will then be followed. He's first up, Ian Mendenhall, and he'll be followed by Dr. Mtokozisi Sibanda. Let's just call him Mtoko. He responds to that name. He's got other short names. He's a good friend of mine. I won't mention them. Then Dr. Peter Sangoro, followed by Mr. Emmanuel Mbuba. And finally, a global review of repellents by Dr. Martin Meyer. To these speakers, sincerely, please accept gratitude from all of us. We appreciate your time. Okay, so our first speaker was going to be, and still is by recording, Dr. Ian Mendenhall. Ian Mendenhall is currently Principal Research Scientist at the National University of Singapore. He studied at the Tulane School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine, where he was awarded a PhD in parasitology with a focus in vector-borne infectious diseases. He was a Fulbright scholar for his dissertation research. So Tin, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the recorded message, the recorded presentation of Ian. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ian Mendenhall. I'm a principal research scientist at Duke NUS Medical in Singapore. I'd really like to thank Dr. Brock for inviting me to this fantastic program. Very honored to share this with the other excellent scientists on the board, and my apologies for not being able to join you live today. So my talk today is on the spatial repellency of transfluthrin on Anopheles dirus and Anopheles minimus in Vietnam. Obviously, these projects aren't done in a silo, and I had some very excellent collaborators from the National Institute of Hygiene and Epidemiology in Hanoi, University of Massachusetts. I'm Dr. Andrew Lover, and the Naval Medical Research Center. So we know with Vietnam and malaria and spatial repellency that malaria cases are decreasing in Vietnam, and they're primarily in the central and southern regions. In 2016, we had 4,100 cases, primarily Plasmodium falciparum and Plasmodium vivax, and the major vectors in Vietnam are Anopheles dirus and Anopheles minimus. And in terms of spatial repellents, I think the audience is fairly well aware of them. These are semi-volatile insecticides. Typically, you impregnate them on fabric or you impregnate them on a particular medium that you can burn, and it acts to repel vectors. Now, transfluthrin is a commonly used insecticide. It's a synthetic pyrethroid. It's volatile and fast acting, and we really wanted to see, is this an appropriate tool to employ in Vietnam against their two primary vectors? So in terms of the study design, all work was performed at the National Institute of Hygiene and Epidemiology in Hanoi. This project was actually based off of previous work where we were interested in the impact of transfluthrin on Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. And we really wanted to understand on the two local malaria vector species, how this chemical would either act to kill them or act to repel them. And so we kind of constructed a semi-field enclosure within Nihei where we netted off a section. And then we also wanted to understand the impact on distance from the treated material and the impact on height. And in terms of how long the treatment would be effective for in terms of repellency. So we used a 60-minute exposure for the mosquitoes on days 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. And we used two different sizes of fabric, so 1 meter by 3 meter and a 2 meter by 3 meter. So we were interested in mortality, and with this we used these mortality cages here, you can see on the left. And in each of these we had 25 Anopheles dirus and 25 Anopheles minimus. The cages were set on the floor at 1.5 meters and 3 meters, and then we had them at different distances from the fabric, 2 meters, 4 meters, 8 meters, 12 meters, and 16 meters. And we had control cages used just to monitor handling mortality. We also used taxus cages, and these will kind of illustrate if a mosquito is either attracted to or repelled or just has a neutral behavior to the exposure of an insecticide. And in each of these taxus cages, we had 50 females of both species. And we put these taxus cages 2 meters, 4 meters, 8 meters, and 12 meters from the fabric. So this is kind of the internal schematic of the site that we used. And you can see that we also had air monitors, and we were trying to understand kind of what's the concentration of the chemical at different heights and different distances to see if we could correlate that with either mortality or repellency. And you can see in the back that the fabric is hanging there, and the fabric was left to hang. And then on each of our trial days, we would bring in mosquitoes in the taxus cages and in the mortality cages and expose them to 60 minutes. So in terms of mortality and sampling difference, you can see that mortality clearly when you're at 2 meters and 4 meters, there was a fair amount of mortality, and Anopheles minimus definitely more susceptible than Anopheles dirus to this chemical. Both of the species were tested with WHO insecticide susceptibility kits to make sure that they were completely susceptible. So at least these colony mosquitoes should be a baseline for understanding mortality when exposed to transfluthrin impregnated materials. In terms of repellency, what we saw is that primarily the mosquitoes stayed in the neutral compartment of the taxus cages. So the taxus cages have 3 compartments. All the mosquitoes are in the middle, and then if they're repelled by the transfluthrin, they will move to the compartment that is farther away from the impregnated material. If they're attracted, they will move towards the front. And I think what we experienced here with the majority of mosquitoes in the neutral section was that they were simply knocked down by the chemical, and they may not have had an opportunity to be able to be repelled by it. So that's something we're thinking about for future trials. In terms of conclusions, we know minimus is about 1.3 times more sensitive than dirus. And then the larger fabric is associated with about 2 times higher mortality. So that's something to definitely think about. And likely for repellency, if the mosquitoes aren't experiencing kind of immediate knockdown, this may be a better way to go. When adjusted for distance and sampling height, mortality and knockdown drops off very rapidly after the first few time periods. And with our concentration, I think we got down, there was a limit of detection. And we found that, after the first few sampling periods, that we were unable to detect the chemical with those particular air collection equipment. That at 2 meter sampling, if you're close, there's a very high mortality and knockdown relatively to the 16 meter, but in terms of the repellency, we still didn't see that with the taxus cages. So we think in terms of future work, we're very interested in kind of lower treatment concentrations. And I think one issue is standardizing the material that we're impregnating. I know that we went to the market and we bought burlap, and that's traditionally what's used, but we know that kind of the surface contours are going to be different for each material you use, and that's really going to impact the volatility of the chemical coming off of it. So I think some standardization in material that's used across spatial repellency trials would be fantastic. So very much thank everyone, and hope you have a wonderful Congress.
Back to you, Leo. Leo, are you there?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. My apologies. So just to say again, wonderful presentation, lots of information there. I'd be interested to know more about, how long does the repellent effect last, the duration, the durability of the impregnated material before you need to re-impregnate it, but certainly the base efficacy seems very good, very impressive. So let's move now then to our second presentation, which is by Dr. Mtoko Sibanda. Dr. Sibanda has a PhD in chemical engineering, and he's the founder of a biotechnology startup company that develops and commercializes innovative mosquito vector control products. I had the privilege of working with Mtoko on some of these repellent projects at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and I have great respect, Mtoko, for your innovative thinking and your qualities as a person and a family man. So over to the presentation by Mtoko, please. Mtoko, I think you're expecting us to pull up the presentation on your behalf. There we go. All right.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning here in Pretoria, and good afternoon in Bangkok. I would like to share with you the work that we've done in developing textile-based, long-lasting insect repellent devices to mitigate outdoor malaria transmission. Okay, next slide. Next slide, please. Yes. Okay, so basically our study really focuses on vector control. There are two arms, parasite control and vector control when it comes to malaria control. And we were looking at vector control with the aim of dealing with mosquitoes that transmit malaria in outdoor settings. Next slide, please. Okay, so our work was premised on the work done by Professor Leo Brack in his two papers, one in 94 and one in 2013, he showed that mosquitoes tend to bite mostly on the ankles and feet, lower limbs, generally when they are biting outdoors. So this was a challenge that was presented to us to say, how can we reduce the ankles and feet, and by reducing those bites would reduce outdoor malaria transmission. Okay, so you can use topical insect repellents to reduce bites on the ankles and feet. The problem with topical repellents is they have a very short residual efficacy. They only last for a few hours, and you need to reapply the insect repellent. Now, this becomes a problem because it becomes expensive, particularly for people in resource-limited communities where malaria is prevalent. So we wanted to come out with a product that was cost-effective and that was also very effective for a long period of time, in the order of months instead of hours, in protecting the lower limb area from mosquito bites. Okay, so we came up with a textile fiber, and this textile fiber was specially engineered to be infused with an organic insect repellent. And what this fiber does, it stores the insect repellent, liquid insect repellent, stores the insect repellent in the fiber and slowly releases the insect repellent through its matrix. And the ultimate effect of this is it reduces the volatility of the insect repellent and extends its residual effectiveness to many months, as I'm going to show shortly in this presentation. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are just the snippet of the technicalities with regards to development of this fiber. I'm not going to go into it very much. If there's anyone interested in discussing how we made the fiber, please, you can send me an email and we can pick up that discussion. Next slide. Okay, so we made prototype products. In this case, we made a prototype insect repellent sock, and we tested this sock in the lab using about between 300 and 500 female blood feeding mosquitoes. Basically, you insert your feet in a cage with this number of mosquitoes. One foot you have the control sock, and the other foot you have the treated sock. And we exposed those feet to those mosquitoes, and we observed the biting behavior of mosquitoes. I don't know whether you can try and hover around the video, see whether it plays. Yes, yes, please. So you can see on the right-hand side, it's the repellent sock. On the left-hand side is a control sock. You can see the difference in terms of effectiveness. And we managed to show that this product is effective, 100% effective, even after 25 washes. Okay, next slide, please. So we are using this infused fiber to manufacture a number of commercial devices that can be used to prevent lower limb bites. We are making ankle bands, repellent ankle bands that you can wear around your ankles. We're also manufacturing insect repellent hiking socks. Just last week, I received a prototype insect repellent sandal, and the straps of the sandal are made out of this fiber that is emitting insect repellent. In this case, we infused the fiber with IR 3535. Sorry for, I haven't done a professional photography of the sandals. These sandals currently undergoing field trials in Mozambique, and hopefully we can generate a lot of data on the effectiveness of using these devices in the field. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so in conclusion, we managed to show that we can make fibers that are infused with insect repellents in a cost-effective manner. And we also managed to show that these products are very effective in preventing lower limb mosquito bites, at least in the lab. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would like to acknowledge these institutions for the financial and technical assistance that they've provided us. Thank you.
A wonderful presentation. Thank you, Mtoko. Very innovative, and I think you've just started opening the can of possibilities that these impregnated fibers lend themselves to. I can think of multiple different applications for your woven, just weaving or using those impregnated fibers in different kinds of products for mosquito repellents in different ways. So thank you for that, Mtoko. Wonderful presentation. Our third presentation, then we move on to Dr. Peter Sangoro. Let me first say this. There seems to be some audience members that are under the impression that Ian Mendenhall is part of the webinar physically present. And you obviously missed the first part of the webinar where I mentioned that Ian's daughter had an accident. He's not present with us today. His daughter has a foot injury and he's looking after his daughter. But he sent us a recorded presentation, and that is what you were watching. But Ian is not available to respond to questions, unfortunately. So Dr. Peter Sangoro is a postdoctoral research fellow in integrated vector management at the International Center of Insect Physiology and Ecology, ISIPE, in Nairobi, Kenya. And he's going to talk to us about repellent impregnated sandals. And we look forward to learning from you, Peter. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Oops. Okay.
Take your time. No problem. Don't worry. Here we are.
Good afternoon, everyone. And good morning, everyone, as well. So I'm going to talk about impregnated treated materials against malaria vectors in rural Tanzania. This is work we did from 2014 to 2017. And I've included some work of a colleague of mine in Ifakara, Arnold Mbando, which I'll also share with you. But if you have any questions, then you can get in touch with him. You can get in touch with me, and I'll get you in touch with him.
Peter, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I ask you to put your screen full screen, because it's got the slides on the side. Yeah, let's try do it full screen. Thank you.
Okay, that's good enough. Can everyone see that? Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about impregnated materials. And so first is the importance of outdoor malaria control and why we decided to come up with impregnated materials. So as we all know, primary control measures, LLINs, IRS, and diagnosis and case management has had a great impact on malaria transmission. It has had reduced malaria transmission to up to about 60% from 2000 to 2015. However, it should be noted that it's not only these control measures, there are mega trends. This is improved livelihoods, so improved housing, better nutrition, better education, urbanization, which has led to removal of mosquito breeding sites. All these factors have led to a downtrend in malaria transmission. And up to 2015, we saw up to about 60% reduction in malaria transmission in rural Africa. So as a result of this, there has been renewed calls for malaria transmission, for malaria elimination in these endemic settings. However, despite the great progress that has been made, reports from 2016 onwards has showed that this progress has stalled. malaria report for 2017 shows that malaria control has told in some areas. There's even been an increase in malaria transmission.
Peter, can I interrupt again? I'm very sorry to bother you. You're on presenter view. So half the slide, look at your screen. You'll see half the slide is the actual slide, and then your notes take up the other half of the screen.
Okay, sorry. So,
no problem. No part of you can't.
No.
I think go to your hide presenter view. Try that one. There we go. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
So apologies for that. So so we've seen a downtrend in malaria transmission in endemic areas. However, this progress has stalled, and there are several factors that has led to this stalling. First of all, I would like to think about the financial factors. So decrease in malaria funding. So there's not enough coverage of malaria control tools, and as a result, we see that if not everyone is protected, then some areas that were previously protected is a rise in malaria cases. The operational factors said that in areas where we've seen this decrease in malaria transmission, then there's a laxity in the figure that was used in malaria control before, and as a result, there's also an upturn in malaria transmission in these areas. And the third factor I'd like to talk about, which is the focus of this presentation, is the technical factors. So the spread or the extensive spread of malaria, of insecticide resistance in malaria vectors in these regions, and something that I'd like to call malaria vector resilience. This is, I like to describe it as a shift in malaria vectors behavior from adapting to malaria control tools, where previously they were biting indoors, now they've shifted to malaria biting outdoors. So as a result of this, we developed some tools that we could use to protect against outdoor transmission. So the first tool we developed was the repellent impregnated sandals. This is just locally made sandals, locally manufactured sandals, where it is appended with a Hessian strip, and the Hessian strip is treated with a transphosphine repellent, which we've seen that Ian has talked about. So these are special repellents which produces a bubble of protection. So if you're wearing the sandals, then we expect that you'll receive protection from mosquito bites. So we developed this in 2016, I think, and then we tested this in semi-field and field settings. Where in the semi-field we saw about a reduction in a biting reduction for Arabienses, and in the field we saw a reduction for biting in all mosquitoes, including Arabienses and the nuisance biters. This is Philistines and Mansoni. And then the other impregnated material I would like to talk about is the Eve ribbons, which is the same Hessian material that is impregnated with transphosphine special repellents. And this was used to cover eaves in experimental huts and in the field. And these were tested also against indoor and outdoor biting malaria, where we had someone sitting outdoors up to about 10 p.m. And then from 10 p.m. onwards, the person would go indoors and sleep on a bed that was, and next to the bed we placed the CDC light traps, and then we measured the reduction in bites. So these are the results for, these are published results for these two tools, where we see that repellent treated sandals had up to about 75% reduction in Arabiensis bites. This is outdoors, and the Eve ribbons had about 96% reduction indoors and outdoors. So why do we focus on this on these tools? Recently, we have seen the stalling of malaria control tools of malaria progress in malaria control. And as a result, the WHO and the malaria community has called for a shift in strategy. So in 2005, the WHO came up with the high burden, high impact strategy, where they advocated for locally made solutions for endemic countries. This is because of the downturn in malaria control funding. I think recently we've just seen that the UKRI has slashed the ODA assistance funding to the dependent countries. And then also we've seen evidence that the existing primary control tools, which is LLIANS and RRS, will not be able to eliminate malaria in such settings. So as a result, there's need to develop new tools, and this is why we came up with these tools. And there are several areas which these tools can be used, can be advocated for, so that there's malaria control. For example, in Kenya, we have the Big Four agenda, which is one of the pillars is constructing 500,000 affordable housings. And as a malaria control community, we need to tap into such opportunities where we can advocate that such households be malaria-proof, so we can have the eaves of these households screened with the eave ribbons. And then the other aspect of such a development agenda is enhancing manufacturing. So as we can tap into this and then try to develop innovative tools such as the repellent impregnated sandals, and then we'd have the control tools will be embedded in such agendas. So this exactly are my points why we need to tap into to have a multi-sectoral framework. Like I said before, we've seen as a result also of the COVID, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation shifted focus from entirely to COVID, to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. Then there's the UKRI. And then there's also a shift in the malaria epidemiology as a result of the megatrend that I talked about: urbanization, climate change, land use. And we need to adapt as well to the changing epidemiology. So we need to develop new tools. And then the new tools will be used as a complementary tools to existing tools. So we have nets and IRS protecting indoors, and then such tools protecting against outdoors. There's need for locally tailored solutions to tackle malaria transmission, and also the IVM approach where we need different sectors. For example, we need the housing to build malaria-proof housing, and then we'll need the manufacturing and agricultural ministries, so that all this can be integrated to tackle malaria. Because as recent reports suggest, then no single sector will be able to eliminate malaria in these settings. I think that was basically my presentation. Thank you very much for listening in.
Sorry, Tin, my video is off. Doesn't really matter. At least you should be able to hear me. That's okay. So Peter, sincere thanks. Let me try. Okay. So Peter, excellent presentation. Thank you for that. And thank you especially for contextualizing your findings. You spoke a lot about the bigger picture and how the work that you are doing fits in amongst the other bigger bits and pieces, residual malaria and urbanization, housing, the changes in malaria epidemiology and burden, etc. So well presented, excellent presentation. I found it fascinating. You showed a slide of the actual sandal, and it seems to cover only the front of the foot and not necessarily the ankle, and yet you got 70% plus protection. That's very impressive indeed. So And the problems you have in Africa and the solutions you are testing are equally relevant in Asia Pacific, especially among certain segments of the population, forest goers, people that work at night in forests and so on, outdoor conditions, without protection of bed nets, etc. So, you know, that's why we asked you to give us a presentation, because you have experience and lessons that we can learn from. And you've done just. So we move on to our fourth presentation by Mr. Emmanuel Mbuba, who's a research scientist in the Vector Control Product Testing Unit of the Ifakara Health Institute in Tanzania. His work is part of a PhD, which is registered at the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute. So over to you, please, Emmanuel.
Thank you. Can you see it?
Yes, we can, Emmanuel. Excellent. There we go. Thank you.
Okay. As introduced, my name is Emmanuel Mbuba. I'm working for Ifakara Health Institute in Tanzania, working on the Vector Control Product Testing Unit based in Bagamoyo. Today I'm presenting my work, which is Meyer ointment, a new topical repellent that provides long-lasting protection against Anopheles gambi and Anopheles arabiensis. Down here, you can see a picture of Meyer jar received from the supplier. So, as all we are aware that over 90% of topical mosquito repellents are formulated from DEET. These are very effective, but they have very poor acceptability. And therefore, the compliance among users is a current remaining challenge. So, a more attractive repellents are needed to overcome this challenge. And in this study, we evaluated a cosmetically appealing Meyer repellent ointment that was compared to 20% DEET in ethanol. And our specific objective was to determine the complete protection time of Meyer against pyrethroid susceptible Anopheles gambi and resistant Anopheles arabiensis in the semi-field system. And also was to determine the protective efficacy of Meyer against pyrethroid susceptible Anopheles gambi and resistant Anopheles arabiensis. So the study was conducted in Bagamoyo in Tanzania, as I said earlier. If you are not aware of where Tanzania is located, you can see on the map, and Bagamoyo is a black dot on the grading map of Tanzania. And down here, you can see a logo of the Vector Control Product Testing Unit where I'm working. And the setup of experiment, as you can see in the photograph on the top, this is a semi-field system in which this experiment was conducted. And on the bottom, you can see the sketch of the semi-field system. It has two compartments, compartment A and compartment B. And in compartment A, you will see position P1, P2, and P3. These are different positions in which volunteers who were involved in this study were sitting during the experiment. And on the left, just next to the corner, you can see this cup. This was a mosquito releasing point where lab-layered mosquitoes were released during the experiment. And both chambers were used simultaneously the same day, and two species were tested at the same time. So here you see the procedure. You have a jar and Meyer ointment being measured using Wayne scale. And just to tell you a little bit about the test, we initially tested this product for first 6 hours to determine the complete protection time. And then we saw that this is actually preventing 100% of the volunteers who applied this new ointment. And therefore extended the experiment just to determine the complete protection time. But the application of the repellent was, was conducted 15 minutes before, to 6 p.m., whereby volunteers applied mosquito repellents, both DEET, Meyer, and ethanol. And after that, volunteers were allowed to rest in the semi-filled system. You can see on the photo on the right top corner, volunteers sleeping on the mattress while leaving their legs untouched or not touching the surface. And on the bottom left corner, you will see the Anopheles gambiae and Anopheles arabiensis acclimatization inside the semi-filled system 30 minutes before the experiment. And at midnight, we released 25 mosquitoes on interval until the early morning. And from midnight, these volunteers were allowed to sit on their sitting position, and then you were allowed to correct mosquitoes coming to land on their lower limbs. And correction was done on hourly, whereby every hour the mosquito collected were placed in individual cup, independent of their species. And then at the end of the experiment, we killed all these mosquitoes in the refrigerator and sorted them to species level. And our results, as you can see in this table, we have Meyer, which was our test product. You can see in terms of percentage protection, you see it offered over 95% compared to DEET. And also in terms of complete protection time, actually it gave us over 9 hours of complete protection time. So this was for both strain Anopheles gambiae and Anopheles arabiensis. Then our conclusion, we conclude that Meyer repellent ointment provides long-lasting complete protection time against Anopheles gambiae and Anopheles arabiensis in the semi-filled system, but we know this is done using lab-layered mosquitoes. Also, Meyer repellent ointment provides complete protection time similar to 20% DEET in ethanol. And lastly, Meyer repellent ointment may be recommended as a tool for bite prevention of outdoor biting mosquitoes, especially in the tropical areas, because this study was conducted in such environments. Therefore, we recommend further studies to assess large-scale community acceptability, also to assess protective efficacy against field mosquitoes, and to assess the role of Meyer on malaria reduction in endemic areas. And this is the end of my presentation. I thank Meyer Africa, a company which provides this product for and also the testing facility vector control product testing unit at Ifakara Health Institute. Thank you.
Emmanuel, excellent presentation, fascinating results there. I mean, you were talking there of up to 9 hours or even more of complete protection time. That's the best I've ever heard of. I did a lot of repellent trials in insectaries in South Africa, and even DEET, commercial DEET, I could never get to match the 8 hours or so kind of marketing hype. So if you got 9 hours complete protection time, that's extremely impressive. The other wonderful aspect of the Meyer cream or ointment or lotion is that around social acceptability. I think Meyer was first developed and used in West Africa. And in those people there, there's a cultural practice where women wash their small children late afternoon and then apply ointment. This is a cultural thing that they do there. So, you know, applying ointment after being bathed in late afternoon is a culturally acceptable practice, and that makes it that much easier to introduce a product like that has DEET incorporated into the ointment. How well it will go down in Asia Pacific, that's a different question with testing, but certainly your results are very, very promising indeed. Wonderful presentation. Thank you, Peter. Emmanuel. So our final presentation, we'd like to welcome Dr. Martin Meyer, who works in multiple African countries, but her current main base in Kenya, where she is a research scientist in the Wellcome Trust research program. Marta is a medical and veterinary entomologist, and among other projects, she's leading the entomology component of a cluster randomized controlled trial evaluating ivermectin mass drug administration for malaria control in both Tanzania and Mozambique. Fascinating subject, that. Dr. Meyer will give us a summary presentation of a Cochrane review on repellents. So over to you, Marta, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Leo, for that nice presentation. I'm just trying to share my screen. Is it on full screen? Can everybody see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, wonderful. So, so thank you for the presentation, and I really want to thank all the other presenters for setting the stage. Now everybody has been aware of all the different products that are out there in development or already available, and how they are used or how they might address the gap for outdoor malaria transmission. So I want to present the results that came about from the Cochrane systematic review on repellents. This review was written in 2018 and is actually now being updated. I wish I could present the updated results, but unfortunately they're not ready. So the Cochrane collaboration is a non-profit, non-governmental agency. It's formed to organize medical research findings so as to facilitate evidence-based choices about interventions. It was formed in 1993 by Archie Cochrane, and it was in response for his call for an up-to-date systematic reviews on randomized controlled trials, so that these could then support the British NHS guideline decision-making. So we have the pyramid of evidence, which I believe most of you should be familiar with. The best evidence starts out with systematic reviews, and usually systematic reviews are based on other studies. The best systematic reviews are based on the best quality of evidence, which is randomized controlled trials, followed by cohort studies, case control studies, case series, case reports. The latter two are not usually included in systematic reviews as they produce very low quality of evidence. And at the base of the pyramid, we have expert opinion. And for some of us, there's also Twitter and Facebook. So some of the mosquito repellents that are out there in the market that most of you are aware of, we have topical repellents, spatial repellents, and now we have a new wave of new products, which are basically accessories like wristbands or shoes. The current mosquito repellent market is valued at $3 billion US, and it is projected to reach $5 billion USD by the end of next year. There is overwhelming entomological evidence that repellents can prevent mosquito bites. Many studies have been done, and we've heard of a few just a couple of minutes ago, the Meyer repellent, for example. We've heard of a few that are this morning. And these studies have been done in a variety of locations, on a variety of vectors, and different active ingredients. So we know that there is high efficacy in reducing mosquito bites. So how does this address the gap that we currently have? Repellents may address the gap that current interventions preclude. And this is because residual malaria, which is defined as all forms of malaria transmission that occur after complete coverage with effective LLINs or IRS is reached, could be addressed by interventions like repellents. Mosquitoes, they have different host seeking and hosts and resting behaviors, and these can change, and these have actually changed in many parts of the world due to selective pressure in response to widespread interventions like LLINs and IRS. So vectors that traditionally would bite indoors are now found more often biting outdoors, or vectors that have plasticity, have higher degree of plasticity, apologies for that, like Anopheles arabiensis, they are also favored. And so they bite outdoors, they'll bite perhaps also on other hosts, maintaining high levels of the population. And repellents may provide a solution as an individual protection measure to protect people from infectious bites before they are protected by an LLIN or whilst they are outdoors. So we defined our systematic review using the PICO acronym, which stands for P, population. In this case, we chose children and adults living in malaria endemic areas. I stands for intervention. We looked at topical repellents, insecticide-treated clothing, and spatial repellents. C stands for control or comparator, and we included studies that had a placebo or no treatment. And O stands for our primary outcomes, which we looked mainly at malaria, either clinical malaria or malaria infection incidence by different parasites. We also looked at other secondary outcomes like all-cause fever and adverse events, but I'm not including these in this presentation today. Inclusion criteria of our systematic review, we only chose studies that would start off with high quality of evidence, which are randomized controlled trials and cluster randomized controlled trials. We were not interested in travelers, so the population was permanent or temporary residents of a malaria endemic area. And different types of interventions included topical repellents such as DEET, PMD, icaridin, picaridin, insecticide-treated clothing, permethrin-treated clothing, and spatial repellents. We looked at coils and also emanators. So the methodology, we started off by doing a search. The search was imported to a software called Covidence, where then two different authors did a title and abstract screening. We decided whether to include or exclude after full text screening. We listed the list of ongoing trials. We excluded trials with reasons, and then we extracted the data using pre-piloted standard extraction forms. And this was done by two independent authors, and when we didn't agree, we called in a third author. All trials were then assessed for risk of bias using the Cochrane tool, which I can explain this better if there are questions, but I'm just going to go over it very quickly. We looked at selection bias, such as flawed randomization method, performance bias, is it blinded or not, detection bias, are the investigators blinded, attrition bias, is there a difference in the amount of participants at follow-up, reporting bias, where we look at funnel plots to see if there are papers that are not reporting low efficacy, for example, and we looked at other sources of bias. Then we did a meta-analysis, and we did the meta-analysis for each intervention type. And for each intervention type, we then subgrouped by either the use or not of LLINs in both arms, and we calculated risk ratios. Data from cluster randomized controlled trials were combined with randomized controlled trials after adjusting for clustering by calculating an effective sample size. And then we looked at heterogeneity by assessing the I-square and the chi-square statistics. We then looked at the quality of evidence, and and assessed it using the grade approach. Quality of evidence from randomized controlled trials and cluster randomized controlled trials starts off as high. So they're starting off with a 4-point score, and then these can be upgraded or downgraded. Reasons for downgrading include if there's a high risk of bias, if the study is imprecise, and have large, very low sample size or large confidence intervals. You can also downgrade if there's a high heterogeneity, and you can downgrade if the study does not directly address the research questions. Reasons for upgrading are quite rare, but they can be the magnitude of effect. If you see a dose gradient response, or if all plausible confoundings would reduce the demonstrated effect or increase the effect if no effect was observed. From our results, we managed to include 10 studies, of which 6 were on topical repellents, 2 on insecticide-treated clothing, and 2 on spatial repellents. 6 were excluded with reasons, and can't really recall, I didn't put it here, but about 5 ongoing studies were documented in 2018. Summary of risk of bias. We found that there was quite a lot of bias in terms of selection and allocation concealment. Often in many studies had alternate randomization or did not explain how they did the concealment. Many studies were not blinded or were improperly blinded. And some studies started off with a baseline imbalance, which is also a source of bias. We'll start off with the forest plots for clinical malaria caused by Plasmodium falciparum. So in the subgroup analysis, it was separated by LLIN usage. Only one study did not include LLINs, that was rolled in 2004. And it reported a 60% protective effect against clinical falciparum malaria, compared to other studies that did not include LLINs in both arms, and the confidence intervals here crossed the point of no effect, which is 1. In regard to clinical malaria caused by P. vivax, we had a very paradoxical result. We measured that repellents increased the risk of P. vivax malaria, but I don't believe that this finding has any epidemiological significance. It's more likely that it's a product of improper study design, because none of the studies cleared vivax infections at the start, and it is unclear if the recrudescent infections were imbalanced across the study arms. Then we looked at malaria infection incidence, which is basically the asymptomatic malaria. Topical repellents, no protection was seen. Some studies were quite imprecise, as you can see here, for example, Hill 2007, with very, very wide confidence intervals, and they crossed the point of no effect. No protection was also seen for Plasmodium vivax infections, with some studies having also very large confidence intervals, like Chain Hussein, and also crossing the point of no effect of 1. In terms of summary of findings, we had to downgrade the data for risk of bias and also inconsistency and imprecision. So some studies did not have proper blinding, others used an alternate randomization system. And so we had to downgrade the quality of the data, and we had low or very low quality of evidence, which this means that we have very little confidence in the effect estimate. And the true effect is likely to be substantially different from the estimate of the effect presented in this review. I'd also like to talk about compliance, because I think this is incredibly important when it comes to topical repellents. Self-reported compliance was generally found to be very high. Most studies used self-reported compliance as their method. And some studies used indirect measures, such as weighing repellent bottles or counting bottles of repellents and doing sniff checks, where field workers go to the village and actually ask to smell people's arms. These methods are not very reliable, and so participants may lie to please the investigating team, which is what we would call a response bias. And they also might dispose of the bottles, or they might share the bottles with other people. So their unreliable data might have made the studies overestimate their reported compliance. And I'd like to note that one of the studies done by Sloyds 2016 in Cambodia, they conducted within that clinical trial a observational study where they sent a spy to the village to observe compliance. So he would document who would comply with the intervention. And he observed that rather than 70% of what was self-reported, only 6 to 15% of the people that he or she observed were actually applying the repellent appropriately. And although people did say they liked the repellent, they often forgot to apply it or just didn't do it appropriately. So aside from compliance, the standardization of the intervention is an issue. So poor compliance can lead to a study to lose power, and that means that studies will end up requiring very, very large number of participants, which is increasingly unfeasible, especially now as we approach malaria elimination. So now on the results from insecticide-treated clothing. Insecticide-treated clothing provided some protection, about 50% protection against clinical falciparum malaria. Neither of these studies, Soto and Rowland, included LLINs, and they were both done with displaced populations. So it's likely that these populations were exposed to harsher living conditions than usual, and so potentially the insecticide-treated clothing were providing some protection because they didn't have access to LLINs or shelters or any other protective measures. P. vivax, there was also a reduction, although not as large as P. falciparum, and the confidence intervals did cross the point of no effect here. It's important to note that neither of these studies cleared P. vivax infections at start. Our summary of findings in regard to insecticide-treated clothing, we also had to downgrade that quality of evidence due to the risk of bias. Blinding was an issue, and a lot of imprecision. As you saw, the confidence intervals were large. And so we conclude that we're not sure about this result. Basically, the actual protective effect may be different from what we are observing. Important to notice that we had very little numbers. We had very little numbers of events, and the sample sizes were quite small. And then in regard to spatial repellents, we only had 2 studies. I believe now there's a new study published, but at that time we only had these 2 studies. And they both had very different results, and they had very large confidence intervals. The risk ratio ranged from no protection to a high degree of protection. And so that's a very high degree of inconsistency and heterogeneity. for that reason, for those reasons, we had to downgrade as well. We note that both studies were severely underpowered and also reported very, very few events. The confidence interval ranged from no effect to almost 2, risk ratio of 2, so a very large benefit. So now we're looking at our study conclusions separated by interventions. In regard to topical repellents, we conclude that we don't have enough evidence. We need better studies. Repellents might be useful if ILINs and ITNs usage is compromised, for example, disaster situations or refugee camps, displaced populations. Poor compliance and standardization of the intervention are major challenges for future studies. Design of future randomized controlled trials may be unfeasible because we might need an unrealistic number of participants to reach statistical power. So I think that other types of study designs should be considered. And so we conclude that there just isn't enough evidence on topical repellents to draw evidence-based conclusions and make well-informed recommendations to policymakers regarding topical repellents as a programmatic malaria control tool. In terms of insecticide-treated clothing, there is some evidence that the use of ITC can be useful in refugee camps or other disaster settings, as they did prove to have some protection in the absence of LLINs. But future research needs to be done in order to generate stronger evidence to support these findings. Also important to notice that that the results only indirectly answered the review question because the participant groups were not the general population. And in regard to spatial repellents, we conclude that we can't draw any conclusions because the qualitative evidence was so low, and there is a need for better studies and to increase the evidence that we have in regard to spatial repellents for malaria prevention. So, despite in the real world, the application of repellents, we have to consider a couple of factors, and we're all very aware of these because this is the field we work in. But a repellent, it has to work, right? So we're looking at repellent efficacy. That's the basis. If it doesn't work, then we're not even going to try testing this in the field. Is it appropriate? If the repellent costs a lot of money, it's probably not appropriate because settings where these interventions are necessary have cost constraints. Then is it ethical? If I use a repellent because I have access to it, what happens to my neighbor who does not have access to it? Will there be diversion of vectors? And lastly, is it accepted? Is it accepted? Do people use it? Is there compliance? So despite high efficacy at preventing mosquito bites, the repellent interventions that were evaluated in this systematic review showed that have very low effectiveness at community level. Additional well-designed studies are needed, but at this stage we need to consider about, rather than widespread usage of repellents, I would say maybe a more targeted use of repellents to high-risk populations, for example, like forest workers or security guards, etc. And that's something that I would take the opportunity to throw into the discussion during the Q&A. Thank you.
So, Marta, I'm very glad that we decided to leave your presentation right to the end and use the defined studies of our other presenters to illustrate specific applications and methodologies and leave it to you to give a comprehensive summary overview of all the different kinds of applications, and you did that very, very well indeed. How disappointing that although individual products may in themselves work very well through insectary trials, etc., it's the bigger issues of community acceptance and compliance, and etc., where they fall down. So one can understand why WHO is so lukewarm in adopting and recommending repellents for mainstreaming against malaria control. Just low quality of evidence that it actually has an impact at community level malaria reduction. And more work needs to be done, especially in community engagement and trying to increase community acceptance and compliance and so on. But Marta, a wonderful presentation that I think was very useful to everybody in the audience. There are on the chat box many compliments coming through, thanking you for an excellent presentation. So we come to our question and answer session. To our audience, we had some, I know that there are a lot of questions in the Q&A box, but in fairness, we did have a few questions come in from people during the registration process. So I'm just going to focus on a couple of those first. The first one we received was from Dr. Jeffrey He. Now, we all know Dr. Jeffrey He. He's extremely thorough and meticulous and professional in his comments and questions and responses and so on. So once again, this is an example of the professional nature of Dr. Jeffrey He. His question is, and I'm going to ask Marta if you can think about responding to this one. Recent studies in Cambodia and Thailand of passive spatial emanators in forested areas show that the efficacy is less than perfect at an individual level. For example, a single metafluorine dispenser reduced the outdoor biting densities of mosquitoes by approximately 1/2, and 4 dispensers located close to the collectors reduced landing rates by up to 2/3. And that's in a publication by Shalwood et al. In Medical and Veterinary Entomology, gives the reference. In outdoor trials, transfluorescent emanation vests provided only 16% protection against Anopheles harrisoni compared with unprotected collectors. And he gives a reference there as well, Sukanan et al. To 2021 in Journal of Medical Journal of Medical Entomology. So then he says, I have a double-barreled question. Would the presenters comment on the diversion of mosquitoes from an individual household who use spatial repellents to households not using such a product? Have you observed, and the second one is, have you observed a community effect? Have you observed a community effect of spatial repellents used by a whole village, similar to those observed earlier with insecticide-treated nets? How would you explain this community effect? Some of these, you've already talked about it in your presentation, but maybe you just want to sum it up again, Marta, if you don't mind. The diversion aspect, and then also community effects. Any comments from you, Marta?
Sure. So we did do a study in Tanzania a while back on diversion of malaria vectors in a village with incomplete coverage of spatial repellents, and we found that the vectors on which there was an effect, meaning that vectors that were repelled by the spatial repellent, because not all vectors were repelled. So Phonestus was not repelled, for example, but Arabiensis was repelled. We found that there was diversion of phanestis, of arabiensis. And this is published, I can send you the link. I can't remember where we published this. It's a bit while back, sorry. But so diversion is definitely something that needs to be considered. And it brings out health inequity questions, because not everyone will have equal access to the spatial repellents. Maybe not everybody will be well informed enough to use it appropriately. LLINs do provide personal protection because they kill the mosquito. The spatial repellents, they don't kill the mosquito. In a semi-field system or in a contained environment, if the mosquito receives a very high dose of the spatial repellent compound, it may be knocked down or have some delayed mortality. But in the field, they will dodge the repellent compound in the air before they can obtain a deadly dose of it. So for those reasons, I don't think community protection will be feasible with spatial repellents. But in regard to some of the studies that he mentioned, these are all studies that measure entomological outcomes. They do not measure epidemiological outcomes. And we know that they can reduce landings. Repellents reduce mosquito landings. Repellents protect the user. But epidemiological importance of those interventions is epidemiological impact of those interventions was very low in the systematic review. And maybe diversion has something to do with it, because lack of compliance. I also saw a comment about how community engagement during the trial done by Sloits in Cambodia maybe was improper. But I would argue, if you can't do proper community engagement during a trial, which is a very targeted study, how would you do community engagement in a programmatic level, on a country level? It would be a lot harder. So community protection by repellents, I think, is something that is still on the table. Certainly protective on a personal level, but on a community level, highly doubt it. Yeah, over.
Okay, thank you for that, Marta. Hopefully you got at least part of your response you required, Jeffrey. So then we also had a registration stage question by Dr. Miu Min. Hello, Min, good to have you on board, if you are on board, in fact, during this presentation. You asked, elimination of vivax malaria is a great challenge for malaria elimination by 2030. As you all know, vectors mainly transmit vivax malaria, most commonly early and outdoor biting. Therefore, what is the most effective and innovative repellent to prevent transmission of vivax malaria? So, Min, so, you know, as far as I know, this exact same vectors that transmit Falciparum malaria are responsible for vivax malaria. So, you know, what has worked, or to the extent that they have worked against outdoor transmission reduction against vectors for Falciparum malaria to date, would be the ones that you should be looking at to employ against vivax vectors. I don't think, you know, the parasites discriminate or the vectors discriminate on the basis of which parasite species they're being exposed to. Both are equally effective. And so you're not going to find a repellent that discriminates between vivax and Falciparum vectors. You've seen some of the methods being used for repellents. They all work to some extent, and some are a bit better than others, but we've seen that the impact at epidemiological level, the quality of the evidence is very thin. So, you know, there are all those qualifiers that you need to consider. Then there was a question also at the registration stage by Lejat Pribadi. When is the best time to use a repellent? And the answer, I think, excuse me just answering, but I think it's a fairly straightforward answer. The best time to use a repellent is any time from dusk to dawn when you are not protected by a bed net, or when you're not indoors where the effect of IRS or bed nets would lend you protection. So the problem with the topically applied repellents that you should really be using in early evening or early morning is that I'm going to stick my head out and say there's not one, at least that I know of, that lasts for 12 hours. So if you apply your repellent early evening, by midnight or so, the effect is declining. So if you go out early morning to make a cooking fire, etc., you are fully susceptible again, and you would need to reapply. But the bottom line is you should be considering repellents anytime you are outside the house during the period when the vectors are active, and that's usually from early dusk to after dawn. So let's go through some of the questions in the Q&A box. So there was one here from Dr. Mohammed Mushfiqur Rahman, and it's addressed to Dr. Peter. What is the durability of insecticide used in sandals, and how many washes will it resist, as sandals might need to be cleaned when it becomes dirty due to mud or any other reasons? And he thanks you for the quality of your presentation. So durability of the insecticide impregnated sandals, Peter.
Thank you very much for your question, Dr. Mohammed. About the durability for our sandals, I think we had about 9 to 10 washes each after every 2 weeks. And there was still about, I would say 40% effective against, we tested this against day biting, which is the Aedes. But there are other studies that show, from my colleague Sheila Ogoma, that shows that the repellent effect of the Hessian material can last up to 6 months at 99% efficacy. So for our sandals, it was about a wash every 2 weeks. It lasted for about, I would say, 9 weeks. With after 9 weeks, it was about 42% protective against Aedes aegypti.
Okay, don't go away, Peter. Here's another question to you from Johnson Omar. How sustainable is use of Hessian fabric, given that jute or sisal plants from which fabric is made aren't quite widely grown? Did you try any other types of fabric like HDPE? So, instead of translucent impregnated jute, did you perhaps try different materials for impregnation?
No. We were able, because we were looking for locally based solutions, we only tried the Hessian strip. I didn't understand the portion where the part where it says that they're not widely grown. I think in Tanzania there is quite significant growth of the sisal plant from which the Hessian material is made. Which context was he talking about when he said it's not very widely grown? I didn't understand, but in Tanzania it's grown quite a bit, and this is why we focused on this, because you can grow it locally and then you can make it into an Hessian tube. And if it's a tool that we would want to progress to manufacturing, then we can easily access this. And then also thinking of empowering the farmers, tell them to grow the Hessian materials for particularly for making translucent sandals, and this would empower them. It would make a whole chain of production. So this was our end. This is what we had in mind, the end game.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So here's a question from Dr. Rose Peter in South Africa. Dr. I think Rose, you were addressing this to Mtoko. Dr. M, presumably Mtoko, what repellents have you tested in your systems? So I think you said you were using DEET. Have you perhaps used other active ingredients in your impregnated strands? Mtoko?
Yes, we have used IR3535, and we've also used a natural formulation called citriodiol, which is is it the 3,8 PMD paramethane 3H diol. So those are the two repellents that we have actively considered for our systems, and they've worked very well.
Okay, don't go away, Toko. Here's another one from Ranjit Alves. Do you need to keep your products dry always? I'm thinking about a situation where the SOx bands can get wet in the field, and would that then impact on the retention or release of product and reduce the long-lasting nature of the socks or sandals or whatever? So if the issue of getting the product wet, but you said, you know, it survives 25 washes, which is very suggestive.
Yes.
But let me
Yes.
not answer, you answer.
Yes, I mean, you have almost answered it. Yes, so the idea really was to have a textile product that could withstand multiple washes. So you can get it wet as much as you can, but it still continues. You only wash what's on the surface of the fiber. You can't wash what's retained within the fiber. And that's what is being slowly released. So even if you wash it, the fiber continues to release the repellent and continues to be effective. So we don't expect to have any reduced efficacy due to it being wet in the field, as we have shown that we could wash the textiles for at least 25 times and we still got 100% repellent effectiveness. We only started to see a decline after the 25 washes. So we can say significantly the textile can withstand water ingress and still continue to be effective.
And I'm sure people would be interested in this as well. Aside from the 25 washes, I think in your trials, Mtoko, you ran the insectary-based trials for at least 6 months, and they were 100% effective, at least during those 6 months, during that 6 month period. So it's 25 washes, or how long was the period you tested it for?
Yes, so the cutoff point, we decided to be 50% protective effectiveness. The method of how we calculated protective effectiveness is in the paper. I hope the paper is going to be shared just to see what we're talking about when you talk of protective effectiveness. So, you know, we kept the sock under ambient conditions. So we washed for at least 25 times. And over that period, I think for 6 months, it had 100% protective effectiveness and gradually started to decline. And I think it reached the 50% cutoff point at 8 months. So we usually say 25 cold washes at least to get 100%. You still get 100% protective effectiveness, or 8% in the open. By 8 months, it will drop to 50% protective effectiveness.
Thank you, Mtoko. So here's a question from Dr. Prudence Hamade, Dr. Sibandad, and I'd like to answer this one, Mtoko, because it's right up my street. Does the sock or the sandal divert the mosquito to other parts of the body? So Prudence, we did probably hundreds of nights of studies in Uganda and South Africa and so on, to look at biting preference sites and so on. And when I say, you know, you get different species of mosquitoes will bite you on different parts of the body. You go and sit outside in a swampland, and Mansonia and other mosquitoes will chew you to bits on your neck and shoulders and other parts of the body. But consistently, the Anopheles malaria vectors, without exception, will bite preferentially strongly on ankles and feet. And then this is the interesting part that answers your question. If you take alternate people and you tie plastic bags around the ankles and feet to exclude access by those vector mosquitoes to the ankles and feet, they do not fly higher to bite elsewhere on the body. They fly away to find a host with exposed ankles and feet. So wearing those repellent impregnated socks or sandals will not divert them to bite higher up the body. It diverts them away from that person in totality. I need to add this. This is at people outdoors sitting or standing. If you put that person flat on the ground, those vectors will bite you anywhere on the body. So it shows it's a height above ground preference, that it's not an instinctive preference for ankles and feet, it's a preference for biting at a preferred height above ground. And it holds for people standing or sitting outdoors at night. And it seems to be valid in Asia as well. So, I mean, I don't want to get bogged down in detail here. It gets complicated indoors because there's so much of a clutter of furniture and bed nets hanging down to the ground. The mosquitoes hit an obstruction at their preferred height, and then they go boing, 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 boing to get over the obstruction. And eventually they end up flying at all heights and biting at all heights indoors. But outside, it's a cleaner situation. So thank you. Here's another question from Prudence. Is sock wearing common in the target population? Ntoko. And you're talking about rural populations, yeah,
yes,
in
yes.
Africa, yeah, and in
So,
Asia.
So I mean, Africa is very hot, and people would not necessarily wear socks. So we developed socks actually for the high income market, the tourists going into these areas. But going forward, we discussed it and thought the best product would be something like a sandal, because it's very suitable for areas where it's hot. People would wear sandals to you know, so that they don't get too hot on their feet. So going forward, what we're testing now in the field is a IR3535 infused sandal instead of socks, and that's what we hope we can take to the low resources or low income market. I think that's the most cost-effective product we can take forward.
Thank you, Mtoko. Here's a question from Dennis Masui. Dr. Sangoro, Peter, thank you for the very nice presentation. I would like to know how long the repellency effect lasts in those sandals. I think you did. Sorry, I think you've covered that, but just sum it up again, please.
Yeah, the repellency effect, when you do the wash fastness, that is about 9 weeks. For washing every 2 weeks, that is how long it would last. But then, of course, it goes down from 70% to 42% after 9 weeks against Aedes aegypti mosquitoes during the day.
Okay, thank you. It seems like we only have time for one more question. We're running out of time. So here is another question from Kien Le. Thanks, Dr. Sangoro. Could you please explain how transflutherin impregnated sandals, presumably, could protect full body with only treated in sandals? Maybe you can explain about vector bite preference sites and why you chose sandals, Peter.
So yeah, I think even Dr. Mtokosizi from South Africa mentioned this. is because we went with Sandals because of actually Professor Brack. He conducted several experiments in South Africa. I think it was with Dr. Maureen Coates, Professor Coates here that time. And it showed that if you protect the feet, it gives about, that 70% protection. And if you cover the feet like he explained, or if you lay down on the ground, the mosquitoes would not bite other parts of your body. They would only go for the ankles. So we thought that if we come up with something that protects the ankles, then it would have significant protection overall on the human host.
Okay. So here's a final question, Dr. Andrew. This one is Maya a plant-based product, and it's actually based on DEET incorporated in a commercial lotion, shea butter. So it's DEET mixed in with shea butter. So this is a fascinating subject and a highly important, relevant topic. So, but we've run out of time, very unfortunately. So I am going to thank everyone, our presenters, our audience, for a wonderful, interactive, very stimulating presentation. Thank you, our presenters. Thank you, our technical team. Thank you, our audience, for making it worthwhile. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. See you in a few weeks' time at our next webinar. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye, Mtoko.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Rose.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Leo. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
There's a poll going on. Would be great if you could spend 2 or so minutes just answering the poll.